Hi everyone, I'm Rob Shapiro from Fitchburg State University, and this is the BACB's 5th edition task list item G-11, use Skinner's analysis to teach verbal behavior. So just speaking about Skinner's verbal operants for a moment. In his book Verbal Behavior in 1957, B.F. Skinner identified several verbal operants. A partial list includes mands, tacts, intraverbals, and echoics. Again, this is a very partial list. Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior goes far beyond these four basic verbal operants, but these are the ones that we'll primarily consider. And Skinner defined these operants based on their function as opposed to their form or part of speech. So essentially, what purpose do these different verbal operants serve? As opposed to what do they look like or how are they used in speech. And it's important to remember that verbal behavior is not confined to vocal behavior. It's sometimes we confuse those two and assume that when we talk about verbal behavior, we're talking about people making vocalizations or speaking. But as we know, it's possible to communicate in many ways without vocal behavior. So when we think about teaching Skinner's verbal operants, teaching verbal behavior involves many of the same considerations as teaching any other behavior. Things such as make sure we have attending, using a constructional approach, which speaks about taking the skills that somebody already has and capitalizing on those as much as possible, providing reinforcement for correct responding. And it's also important to be aware that just because a learner is able to use a word in one way, for example, as a tact, which is a label, we'll talk about that in a minute, doesn't necessarily mean they will be able to reliably use that word in another way, such as an amend, which is a request. So this needs to be assessed and potentially taught. So if we think about the implications of that, just because someone is able to, when you hold up a cookie and say, what is it? They're able to tell you cookie. Doesn't mean that when they want a cookie, they'll be able to say cookie to as a means of requesting that item. Okay, so we need to assess how that verbal behavior is functioning as an operant. So, taking each of those four verbal operants that we're going to consider here in turn, what is a mand? And it can be helpful to think about this word mand by other words that it's similar to. So sometimes it might be referred to as a command, a demand, or a request. Essentially, it's verbal behavior that is under the control of a motivating operation and a history of specific reinforcement. So basically, someone has the motivation for something, they want it, they engage in some specific verbal behavior, and as a result, they gain access to that something. They get the thing that they were motivated to get. So how do we go about teaching people how to mand? So the goal with mand training is to get the learner to reliably mand for or request what they want, such that the mand is under the sole control of the motivating operation. And for this to happen, motivation for the reinforcer has to be present, right? If the person doesn't want the item, it doesn't matter if they engage in the verbal behavior. It's not under the control of the motivating operation. So for it to happen, the motivation for a reinforcer has to be present, which can occur naturally, or it can also be engineered. So, for example, if we're looking to get someone to mand for water or to mand for a drink, right? We can wait for that motivation to occur naturally by just waiting until it's been a while since the person's had a drink. You know, they seem like they're looking to seek out drinks, and then, set the circumstances such that they request a drink or request water. But it can also be engineered if we want to have more learning opportunities. Like, for example, by giving someone something that's salty to eat, which is likely going to increase the motivation for a drink. Now, initial teaching in man training may involve prompts or other extraneous stimuli to occasion responding. But as long as these are present, verbal behavior is under multiple control. It's not purely under the control of the man. Okay, it's not purely a man's, right? For it to be a man, it has to be purely under the control of the motivating operation. So this is important because when we're doing training, even asking, what do you want, constitutes multiple control. Okay, because when we ask, what do you want, it's not just the motivating operation that is evoking the verbal behavior of what the individual wants. There's also, we'll talk about in a bit about what it is, but it's essentially it's intraverbal behavior. They're responding to you saying, what do you want? So it's not purely a man. Now you might be saying, so what? Who cares? But if we think about this for a minute, if it's not a pure man, if it's also under the control of if it's under intraverbal control, under the control of you saying, what do you want? We've got a person who really isn't able to advocate for themselves nearly as effectively as if the man was purely under the control of the motivating operation. If they're reliant on someone saying, what do you want? There are going to be lots of times where there might be a strong MO. The person may want something, but isn't requesting it because no one's asked them what they want. Okay? So this speaks to the importance of having pure mans. So some considerations in conducting mans training. One is thinking about response form. Is there a reliable response form that the learner can engage in? And this can be speech, vocal behavior, but it could also be sign language or the use of icons. And then using motivating operations for instructional purposes. By engineering motivation, manding becomes more likely. So we get this evocative effect. Okay, by making whatever the reinforcer is more valuable, it becomes more likely that the person is going to engage in behavior that results in the delivery of that reinforcer. And this can apply to unconditioned motivating operations, such as using deprivation or exposure to other stimuli, like we talked about, giving the person something salty to eat in order to occasion the requests or the demand for a drink, right? But also, if we think about CMOTs, transitive conditioned motivating operations, we can identify events that create the value of other objects or events. Let's say, for example, that we are we're targeting a man, and we're trying to capitalize on the motivating operation of someone being thirsty, and so we've provided access to salty snacks, right? But now let's say that we've got a water bottle here, right? And let's say that the person doesn't have the manual dexterity right now, or the strength to be able to open that water bottle, right? Now what we've got essentially, and there's a drink inside of here. Now what we can do is we can occasion the value of someone else opening that bottle, okay? And we can work on the mand of open, right? So we can use CMOTs in mand training as well. All right. So moving on to the next verbal operant, and that's a tact. A tact is sometimes referred to as a label. That's an easy way to think about it. And this is verbal behavior that's under the control of a nonverbal discriminative stimulus and a history of reinforcement that isn't specific to the item being tacted. So basically, in the absence of motivation for a particular nonverbal stimulus, the learner names that stimulus and then receives some nonspecific reinforcement. So tact training is more straightforward than mand training because the antecedents, or SDs, are more observable and easier to control. Tacts are also easier to reinforce because non-specific reinforcement can be used. The same reinforcing outcome can be utilized for multiple tacts, and this can put us in a situation where we have to worry less about motivating operations and how something, how someone may become satiated on a reinforcer. Okay, right. So going back to our bottle. the demand for open is only likely to be evoked if there is motivation for what's inside that bottle, right? Whereas if what I do is if I'm going like this and I'm looking for someone to label that as open, right? I can provide lots of non-specific reinforcement. I can provide tokens. I can provide praise. I can provide all kinds of things that the person is less likely to satiate on. So I'm going to be able to, number one, I'm going to be able to know that the item is present. The SD is present. It's clearly observable. And I can provide lots of different kinds of non-specific reinforcement that's not going to be as sensitive to motivating operations. And the goal with tact training is to establish a fluent, generative, functional tact repertoire. So when we're doing tact training, as with man training, we also want to watch for multiple control, and we want to rely on response forms that are in the learner's repertoire. So again, using that generative approach, whether that's vocal verbal behavior or sign or icons, but we also want to be careful that while we may use prompts like, what is it? Or saying the name of something and expecting someone to repeat it, recognizing that if we're providing those prompts, we don't have a pure tact. We've got multiple control, okay? If we're saying, what is it? And someone's telling us, it's also at least partially under intraverbal control. If we say the name of something and hold it up and someone says it back, it's at least partially under echoic control. Someone is echoing what you said. Interestingly, we can also work on tacting private events, and this can be more challenging and relies on public collaterals. And a common example of that might be, how do you teach someone to tact that they have a toothache? Okay, how can you know that somebody else has a toothache? Well, we may have to rely on our public collaterals, like someone sort of holding their hand up to their jaw, or maybe someone wincing when they bite into something. Okay, so if we see those public collaterals, that may give us information that someone has a toothache, and then allow us to reinforce tacts that indicate that. All right, the third verbal operant we're going to consider is the echoic. And we can think of the echoic as repeating what somebody else says. So with an echoic, the form of a vocal response is under the control of an auditory discriminative stimulus, and there is point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity between the stimulus and the response. This is a precise and fancy way of saying the learner repeats what was just said. Okay, there's some auditory stimulus, vocal stimulus, and then there's point-to-point correspondence, so the same thing said in the same way between the stimulus and the response. And then some kind of non-specific reinforcement is provided. So when we're conducting echoic training, early on, it can begin with say whatever the thing is, right? But again, ultimately, that's not where we want to end. Because if for it to be a pure echoic, and we say, let's say water, and what we're looking for is the person to say water, right? For it to be a true echoic, we would have to say water, and they would have to say water. If we said say water, for it to be a true echoic, they would say water. So in the early stages of echoic training, we can pair echoics with mans. You know, we can make sure that there's motivation or tacts to occasion responding. But again, the key is repeating what was said. We can later, though, fade that multiple control. And by pairing saying the word of a preferred item or activity with the presence of that item or activity, we may actually be able to establish the word itself as a conditioned reinforcer. Again, things become conditioned reinforcers based on their repeated pairing with other already established reinforcers. Okay? So if we say the name of something that is reinforcing and have the person repeat that name back, then actually saying that word can, or repeating that word when we say it, can become reinforcing. And having an echoic repertoire in general is a critical skill for further language development. Finally, the last verbal operant that we're going to consider is the intraverbal. And in an intraverbal, the form of a vocal response is under the control of an auditory discriminative stimulus, but there is not point-to-point correspondence between the stimulus and the response. So basically, the learner engages in dialogue. There's a distinct verbal response that's given in the face of a specific verbal stimulus. And then non-specific reinforcement is provided, okay? So basically, someone says something and the learner says something else, not the same thing, okay? So we can think about this as an example might be that the instructor says, Mary had a little, and is looking for the learner to say lamb. That's an intraverbal, okay? Mary had a little lamb. If the instructor said Mary had a little, and the learner said, Mary had a little, now we've got an echoic, right? So it's a distinct verbal response given in the face of a specific verbal stimulus. So how do we conduct intraverbal training? Typically, this is the last of the initial verbal operants that's acquired, and it can include things like simple phrases, songs, and associations, and we just increase it in complexity over time. So things like that, Mary had a little lamb, right? We use established response forms, as we've talked previously, as well as multiple control as necessary. So if we really had to, we could hold up a picture of a lamb, right? Mary had a little right, lamb. And now we've got intraverbal, but it's also under partial control of the tact, right? And then we can look to fade that. And we can teach simple verbal discriminations, such as fill-ins or rote response, such as tell me something round. And that could be a tire, right? Or we can have compound verbal discriminations, which would have multiple components. Give me a round toy. And now we're looking for ball or frisbee, right? It's a little bit, that compound, it's a little bit more complex than a simple verbal discrimination. So in summary, in using Skinner's analysis, Mann's, tacts, echoics, and intraverbals form a portion of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. There are many other operants that can be considered, but these four are the most prominently considered. They all involve considering response form, while also allowing for multiple control in the learning stages, but we've got to have a plan to fade and establish pure verbal operants once responding is occurring reliably, so these can be as useful as possible for our learners.